Hey everybody, this is a section from a chapter in Kenan Malik's The Meaning of Race, Race History, and Culture in Western Society. I'm going to be reading this chapter by section because it's quite long, but the chapter is titled Universalism, Humanism, and the Discourse of Race. It's chapter 8 of the book. What else was I going to say? Yeah, so I'm just going to be reading this by section. This is only the first section. But I'm going to read the introduction to the chapter as well, in addition to the first section. So here we go. A few weeks after the riot that shook Los Angeles in May 1992, I gave a lecture on racism in America to a group of students at North London College. The audience was largely young and black. In the discussion that followed, there was a lively debate over my view that the fragmentation of American society into competing ethnic groups, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Korean Americans, and so on, was a fatal blow to the struggle for black rights. Almost the entire audience disagreed. Quote, African Americans, one student explained, quote, are different. Our problems are different. Our experiences are different. Our history is different, and our culture is different. We have to gain respect for ourselves before we can unite with other people. We have to gain respect ourselves before we can unite with other people. End quote. Here was summed up the core ideas that underpin much of current radical thinking on race. First, that social groups define themselves by their history and identity. Second, that the particular society and identity of each group sets them apart from other social groups. Third, that it is important to recognize this plurality of differences as a positive aspect of society today. And finally, that the struggle for racial equality takes the form of a struggle for group identity. The, quote, assertion of difference, end quote, has become for many radicals the new principal dynamic in society today. Quote, the emergence of new subjects, new genders, new ethnicities, new regions, new communities, end quote, claims sociologist Stuart Hall, has given hitherto invisible groups, quote, the means to speak for themselves for the first time, end quote. Footnote. See Stuart Hall's article, The Local and the Global, in Anthony D. King's edited volume, Culture, Globalization, and the World System, Contemporary Conditions for the Representation of Identity, published in 1991. End footnote. Radicals such as Stuart Hall have welcomed the contemporary flowering of ethnic differences as an expression not of social discord, but of a new form of democracy through which sections of society previously silenced have been given voice. In Britain, for example, the, quote, new ethnicities, end quote, Hall writes, posit a, quote, non-coercive and a more diverse conception of ethnicity to set against the embattled hegemonic conception of, quote, Englishness, end quote, which, stabilizes so much of the dominant political and cultural discourses, end quote. Footnote. See Stuart Hall, New Ethnicities, in James Donald and Ali Ratansi's edited volume, quote, Race, Culture, and Difference. End footnote. During the 80s, the so-called, quote, politics of difference, end quote, emerged to provide an intellectual and philosophical rationale for the kind of arguments expressed by my North London students. The advocates of the politics of difference argue that we are living in a form of society radically different from that of half a century ago, a post-industrial or more fashionably postmodern society. Though postmodernism is an ambiguous term and few have tried to define postmodernism with any great clarity, for most of postmodernism's theorists, the postmodern society is characterized by postmodern society's very heterogeneity and diversity, the postmodern condition is one in which the, quote, grand narratives, end quote, have become discredited. Footnote. See Jean-Francois Lyotard, The Postmodern Condition, a Report on Knowledge. End footnote. Grand narratives are attempts to grasp society in its totality, to give coherence to our observations of the objective world. Nationalism is one such grand narrative because nationalism attempts to impose a collective sense of belonging on disparate individuals. Postmodernists reject all the, quote, great collective social identities of class, of race, of nation, of gender, and of the West, end quote. Footnote. See Stuart Hall's article, Old and New Identities, Old and New Ethnicities, published in King's edited volume, Culture, Globalization, and the World System, end footnote. Postmodernists reject Marxism too, and in fact any form of emancipatory theory, the aim of which is the total liberation of humankind. For postmodernists, the Enlightenment project of pursuing a rational scientific understanding of the natural and social world and of creating a universal outlook from fragmented experience has failed. It has failed because no one can grasp society as a whole. The world is too complex and too varied to be subsumed under a single totalizing theory. Quote, everybody intuitively knows that everyday life is so complex, end quote, argues Kobena Mercer. Quote, that no singular belief system or big story can hope to explain it all, end quote. Footnote. See Kobena Mercer's article, Welcome to the Jungle, Identity and Diversity in Postmodern Politics, published in Jonathan Rutherford's edited volume, Identity, Community, Culture, Difference, published with Lawrence and Wishart in 1993. End footnote. I'm going to look up this person, Kobena Mercer. Kobena Mercer, born in 1960, is a British art historian and writer on contemporary art and visual culture. Kobena Mercer's writings on Robert Mapplethorpe and Rotimi Fani Kayode, I don't know if I'm saying that right, has been described as, quote, among the most incisive, parenthesis, and delightful to read, and parenthesis, critiques of simple identity-based politics in the field of cultural studies, end quote. End footnote. There can be no single theoretical discourse, say postmodernists, which can encompass all forms of social relations and every mode of political practice. Indeed, some reject the idea of theory altogether. Quote, theory is simply that which is labeled theory by institutions that empower themselves to do so, end quote. Footnote. Christopher L. Miller, Theories of Africans, Francophone Literature and Anthropology in Africa. End footnote. Not only are totalizing theories of fantasy, they are a dangerous fantasy. Universalism is, quote, a Eurocentric viewpoint, a means of imposing European American ideals of rationality and objectivity on other peoples. Universalism is racist because universalism denies the possibility of non-European viewpoints. The intellectual arrogance of universalism, argue such critics, has led to the attempt to eliminate not just non-European thought, but also non-Aryan people. The science and technology that flowed from Enlightenment rationalism was inevitably tainted with the spirit of savagery. Not just for postmodernists, but for many post-war social theorists, the road that began with Enlightenment rationalism ends in Nazi death camps. Quote, concentration camps, mass exterminations, world wars, and atom bombs are no, quote, relapse into barbarism, end quote, wrote Herbert Marcuse, quote, but the unrepressed implementation of the achievements of modern science, technology, and domination, end quote. Marcuse. Footnote. Marcuse, Eros and Civilization. Hostility to universalism has led many contemporary social theorists to celebrate plurality or fragmentation. Social fragmentation, they argue, is a way of giving voice to those who have been previously excluded from the political arena. Quote, the idea that all groups have a right to speak for themselves in their own voice and have that voice accepted as authentic and legitimate, end quote, notes David Harvey, quote, is essential to the pluralistic stance of postmodernism, end quote. David Harvey in The Condition of Postmodernity. The advocates of plurality argue that the assertion of difference helps undermine the grip of the dominant groups over political and social discourse. Traditional politics, they say, serves to silence the voices of the weak and of the oppressed, to consign their histories and experiences to the margins, and to subsume all experience in the dominant outlook. Because British history is written by those who want to create a singular national identity, it denies the experiences and histories of, for example, black people who are not part of that singular identity. By, quote, decentering discourse and giving hitherto marginalized groups center stage, it is possible to create a more democratic form of social dialogue. This embrace of difference obviously stands in stark contrast to the argument that I have developed in this book, whereas I have argued that it is the degradation of universalism that has given rise to the discourse of race. Post-structuralist and postmodernist theories take universalism itself to be the source of a racial outlook. Where I have placed stress on ideas of difference as lying at the heart of racial theories, many contemporary theorists regard the right to be different as an essential part of any anti-racist strategy. I want in these final two chapters, therefore, to engage with post-structuralist and postmodern theories of difference. I want through such critical engagement both to reveal the flaws of contemporary theories of difference and to re-articulate the main themes of my thesis. I will in the course of this chapter be examining the ideas of a number of writers from a variety of theoretical outlooks and academic disciplines, structuralism and post-structuralism, Marxism and deconstructionism, phenomenology and postmodernism. My intention is not to erase the differences between the authors and outlooks, nor to ignore the often heated debates that have taken place between the various protagonists. Rather, it is to demonstrate the common threads that link the diverse strands of contemporary theory, and to suggest that, for the purpose of our discussion of racial theories, these commonalities far outweigh in importance the differences that are often expressed. In this spirit, I shall use the terms, quote, post-structuralist and, quote, postmodernist interchangeably to refer to discourses and theorists influenced by the work of such as Claude Lévi-Strauss, Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and similar thinkers. Their work, though varied and often conflictual, is characterized by a number of themes, including a critique of reason, a hostility to universalism, a rejection of humanism, an anti-realist epistemology, and a radical relativism. I have not sought to provide a comprehensive critique of these ideas, but rather simply to engage with them in such a fashion that the main themes of my own thesis are clarified. Okay, so here we are. Here's the first section of the chapter, which is titled, The West and the West's, quote, others. Quote, the world begins to be decolonized, end quote. Stuart Hall writes, quote, at that moment when the unspoken discovered that they had a history which could speak, end quote, and that they had, quote, languages other than the languages of the master, end quote. Footnote, Stuart Hall, article, The Local and the Global in King's edited volume, Culture, Globalization, and the World System. And footnote. The central argument is in contemporary theories of difference is the idea that Enlightenment discourse, by establishing universal norms and by equating such norms with European societies, and cultures has ensured the silence of non-European peoples and cultures, quote, without significant exception, end quote. Edward Said has argued, quote, the universalizing discourses of modern Europe and the United States assume the silence, willing or otherwise, of the non-European world. There is incorporation, there is inclusion, there is direct rule, there is coercion, but there is only infrequently an acknowledgement that the colonized people should be heard from, their ideas known, end quote. Edward Said, Culture and Imperialism. Wikipedia says Culture and Imperialism is a 1993 collection of thematically related essays by Palestinian-American academic Edward Said, tracing the connection between imperialism and culture throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The essays expand the arguments of Orientalism to describe general patterns of relation between the modern metropolitan Western world and their overseas colonial territories. Back to the text. And footnote. Western science and philosophy, such critics believe, have established a form of knowledge whereby non-Western societies and cultures are represented solely in terms of the categories of Western thought, and in which Western society acts as a standard against which all other societies are judged. This inevitably leads to the silencing of other voices. At the same time, the differences between Western and non-Western cultures are rationalized through non-Western peoples being defined as the, quote, others, distinguished solely through their antagonism to the dominant image of the, quote, self, and against whose peculiarities the self-image of the West is created. The result has been the acquisition of an aura of superiority for Western cultures and an imposition of a sense of inferiority upon non-Western ones. From the Renaissance onwards, Stuart Hall explains, Europe began to define itself in relation to a new idea, quote, the existence of many new, quote, worlds, end quote, profoundly different from itself, end quote. Stuart Hall, article, The West and the Rest, Discourse and Power, published in Stuart Hall and Bram Giebon's edited volume, Formations of Modernity, Understanding Modern Societies. End footnote. This gave rise to the discourse of the other, which, quote, represents what are in fact very differentiated, parenthesis, the different European cultures, end parenthesis, as homogeneous, parenthesis, the West, end parenthesis, end quote. Further, quote, it asserts that these different cultures are united by one thing, the fact that they are all different from the rest. Quote, it asserts that these different cultures are united by one thing, the fact that they are all different from the rest, end quote. At the same time, the, quote, other, parenthesis, or the, quote, rest, in Hall's terminology, end parenthesis, quote, though different among themselves, are represented as the same in the sense that they are all different from the, quote, all different from the West, end quote. Stuart Hall. The sense of, quote, otherness that Western discourse imposes on non-Western peoples and cultures is seen as the source of the modern ideas of race. Quote, the figure of the, quote, other, end quote, writes Hall, was, quote, constructed as the absolute opposite, the negation of everything the West stood for, end quote. Stuart Hall. Through the representation of an absolute difference between the West and the West others, the idea of difference took on a racial form. Quote, race emerged with and has served to define modernity by insulating modernity's self in various fashions into modernity's prevailing conceptions of moral personhood and subjectivity, end quote. David Goldberg believes. quote, by working itself into the threads of liberalism's cloths, cloths, I guess that's how you say it, quote, by working itself into the threads of liberalism's cloths, just as that cloth was being woven, race and the various exclusions, race licensed, became naturalized in the Eurocentric visions of itself and its self-identified others in its sense of reason and rational direction. End quote. Goldberg, Racist Culture. Page 10. Use David Goldberg. What's... The description for David Theo Goldberg's book, Racist Culture, Philosophy and Politics of Meaning, says, racist culture offers an anti-essentialist and non-reductionist account of racialized discourse and racist expression. David Goldberg demonstrates that racial thinking is a function of the transforming categories and conceptions of social subjectivity throughout modernity. He shows that racisms are often not aberrant or irrational, but consistent with prevailing social conceptions, particularly of the reasonable and the normal. David Goldberg shows, too, how this process is being extended and renewed by categories dominant in present-day social sciences. Quote, the West, quote, the underclass, and quote, the primitive. This normalization of racism reflected in the West mirrors South Africa in its use and conception of space. Goldberg concludes with an extended argument for a pragmatic anti-racist practice. So that's the description for racist culture, philosophy and the politics of meaning. Wikipedia says David Theo Goldberg is a South African professor working in the United States, known for his work in critical race theory, digital humanities, and the state of the university. Back to the text. Since the framework of, quote, the West and the West others, end quote, is so central to contemporary theories of the meaning of race, I want to examine more closely some of the framework of, quote, the West and the West others, end quotes, assumptions. The concept of the other was developed in the phenomenological tradition, particularly by Edmund Husserl, as a constitutive factor in the subject's self-image. The other was conceived as the perceiving, conscious, meaning-conferring other person who helps or forces the conscious subject to define the conscious subject's own world picture and the conscious subject's view of the conscious subject's place in the conscious subject's own world picture. Through the work of writers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Jacques Lacan, and Michel Foucault, the concept of the other entered post-structuralist discourse. Footnote, and there's a bunch of books. Lévi-Strauss, Structural Anthropology. Lévi-Strauss, The Savage Mind. Jean-Paul Sartre, Being in Nothingness. Jacques Lacan, Écrits, A Selection. Jacques Derrida, Speech and Phenomena, and other essays on Husserl's theory of signs. Jacques Derrida of Grammatology. Jacques Derrida, Writing and Difference. Michel Foucault, Madness and Civilization. Michel Foucault, The Order of Things. Michel Foucault, The Archaeology of Knowledge. End footnote. In post-structuralist discourse, the other is a social object, the difference against which the self is measured. In Michel Foucault's seminal work, Folie et Déraison, Lepers were the others of medieval society, a prime source of contamination, whose exclusion from everyday life helped provide society with a sense of society's normality. And Folie et de Raison refers to Madness and Civilization, a history of insanity in the age of reason. Madness and Civilization is an examination by Michel Foucault of the evolution of the meaning of madness in the cultures and laws, politics, philosophy, and medicine of Europe from the Middle Ages until the end of the 18th century, and a critique of the idea of history and of the historical method. Although Foucault uses the language of phenomenology to describe the influence of social structures in the history of the othering of insane people from society, Madness and Civilization is Foucault's philosophic progress from phenomenology towards something like structuralism, a label Foucault himself always adamantly rejected. End footnote. Back to the text. As leprosy became less common, so leprosy was less able to play leprosy's previously symbolic role. Instead, argues Foucault, a new other was born, those who were non-productive, the criminal, the homeless, and especially the mad. Quote, a new leper is born, end quote, writes Foucault, quote, who takes the place of the first, end quote. Footnote, Foucault. Michel Foucault, Folie et de Raison, Histoire de la folie à l'âge classique. I don't know. An abridged English version can be found in Madness and Civilization, translated by Richard Howard, 1967. End footnote. The other, then, is that which lies outside a particular culture or society's epistemological boundaries. Not only is everything beyond the boundary treated as the other, but society requires another without which there can be no sense of self. A single category that can encapsulate the idea of an object of study, an object of exclusion, and an object through the perception of whose difference self-identity can be affirmed, has proved very attractive in the study of race. Most contemporary studies define racial difference in terms of the other. The distinction between the West and its other is, for many contemporary theorists, implicit in the category of Enlightenment universalism. Stuart Hall has pointed how the establishment of the other was fundamental to the development of Enlightenment thought. Quote, this, quote, West and the rest, end quote, discourse greatly influenced Enlightenment thinking, ... In Enlightenment discourse, the West was the model, the prototype and the measure of social progress. It was Western progress, civilization, rationality, and development that were celebrated. And yet, ... without the rest, parenthesis, or its own internal, quote, others, end quote, end parenthesis, the West would not have been able to recognize and represent the West's self as the summit of human history. The figure of the, quote, other, end quote, banished to the edge of the conceptual world and constructed as the absolute opposite, the negation of everything which the West stood for, reappeared at the very center of the discourse of civilization, refinement, modernity, and development in the West. Quote, the other, end quote, was the, quote, dark, end quote, side, forgotten, repressed, and denied, the reverse image of enlightenment and modernity, end quote. Stuart Hall, The West and the Rest. According to such critics, through the discourse of universalism, the characteristics of the West and the West others were internalized and the differences established as absolute. Thus, Peter Hume observes that Western understanding of non-Western cultures creates a distinction between, quote, self and, quote, other by, quote, establishing characteristics as eternal verities, immune from the irrelevances of the historical moment, quote, ferocious, quote, hostile, quote, truculent and vindictive, end quote. These are present as innate characteristics irrespective of circumstances, end quote. Peter Holm. Footnote. See Peter Holm, Colonial Encounters, European and the Native Caribbean. European and the Native Caribbean, 1492 to 1797. The description for this book says Europe encountered America in 1492, a meeting of cultures graphically described in the logbook kept by Christopher Columbus. His stories of peaceful savages and cruel, quote, cannibals have formed the matrix for all subsequent descriptions of the native Caribbean society. The encounter itself has obsessed colonialist writing. It reappears in the early 17th century in the story of John Smith and Pocahontas, on the Jacobean stage in the figures of the Jacobean stage in the figures of Prospero and Caliban. In the 18th century, over 200 years after the European discovery of the Caribbean, the idea of a pristine encounter still permeated European literature through Robinson Crusoe's emblematic rescue of the Carib he called Friday. The last version, the enormously popular tale of Inkle and Yuriko, was contemporary with the final military defeat of the remaining native Caribbeans in the 1790s. Peter Holmes' detailed analysis of these stories brings to light the techniques used to produce within colonial discourse a, quote, savagery that could be denied the right to possess in law the land that it cultivated. This book should be of interest to undergraduates and academics in the field of Renaissance, 18th century literature, and post-colonial criticism. End footnote. End of description. Yeah. Back to the text. Many of these ideas have been central to my thesis in this book. I have argued, for instance, that the discourse of race helped recast social differences as natural differences, eternalizing what were historically contingent features. I have argued, too, that in certain circumstances, the notion of the, quote, other has helped establish a sense of self-identity. Despite this, I wanted to argue that the framework of, quote, the West and its others, end quote, is unhelpful in understanding the concept of race. The category of the other is ahistorical and takes little account of the specificities of time and place in the creation of the discourse of race. Instead, it steamrollers historical, social, and geographical differences into a single course of, quote, the West and its others, end quote. The category of the other eternalizes human modes of production. The category of the other... It's not what I said. I said the wrong thing. Sorry. The category of the other eternalizes human modes of perception. The category of the other takes historically specific ways of constructing identity and endows them with an eternal validity. In Brighton's, her entertaining study of the development of British national identity, Linda Colley argues that the idea of being British arose in opposition to perceived enemies. Quote, it was an invention forged above all by war. Time and time again, war with France brought Britons, whether they hailed from Wales or Scotland or England, into a confrontation with an obviously hostile other, and encouraged them to define themselves collectively against it. ... And increasingly, as the wars went on, they defined themselves in contrast to the colonial peoples they conquered, peoples who were manifestly alien in terms of culture, religion, and color. Britishness was superimposed over an array of internal differences in response to contact with the other, and above all in response to conflict with the other, end quote. Linda Colley. Footnote. See Linda Colley, Brighton's Forging the Nation, 1707 to 1837. This book has a Wikipedia page. Brighton's Forging the Nation, 1707 to 1837 is a history written in 1992 by Linda Colley. Brighton's charts the emergence of British identity from the Act of Union in 1707 with Scotland and England to the beginning of the Victorian era of 1837. British identity, Linda Colley argues, was created from four features that both united the Britons, I don't know how you say that, Britons, I guess, and I'll say Brightons, I don't fucking know. What does Google tell me to say? Britain. One second.
Britain.
Okay. Yeah, Britain. British identity, Cole argues, was created with four features that both united the Britons and set the nation apart from others. 1. Britain is a Protestant state defined against a largely Catholic Europe. 2. Britain is an island nation with a strong navy rather than a massive army. Britain is a metropole. Britain is a direct rival to France. Coley's analysis of the source of British identity in the 19th and 20th centuries led Coley to wonder whether British identity will survive in the future, now that so much of what made the Britons British, religion, empire, disaffiliation from the continent, has been lost. Britons won the Wolfson History Prize in 1992. Britain's begins at the period after the 1707 Act of Union, when the diverse peoples of Britain developed a sense of, quote, Britishness, based largely on their perceived differences from other Europeans. A common commitment to Protestantism provided Britons with a unifying history and a constant enemy in Catholic France for over a century, reinforced by the growth of British trade and mercantilism. Colley contends that Jacobite insurrection of 1745 against the Hanoverian government was unsuccessful because the twin forces of Protestantism and financial interest of the merchant class motivated Britons to stand firmly against a Catholic Stuart uprising and the economic destabilization it would bring. British unity was shaken after the overwhelming success of the 7 Years' War, which left Britain with a huge foreign empire to rule, turning Britain into a military power and forcing Britain's citizens to re-examine their definition of Britishness and empire. Losing the American Revolutionary War made the country more patriotic and set the ideas of monarchy, military, and empire at the center of British identity. George III was more attentive to the royal image than his predecessors and came to be loved by his people. Total war with Napoleonic France provided women an opportunity to carve out their own niche, however small, for themselves in the public sphere, working in support of the war effort and the royal family. Just as war transformed women's participation in public and political life, so too did war lead to increased political power for men, because the government needed mass military participation during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. During the 1830s, the unity of the British nation was challenged by three reform crises: the expansion of the rights of Catholic citizens, the movement of the parliamentary reform, and the abolition of slavery. These reform efforts gave a great number of Britons their first opportunities to engage directly in the political life of the nation. The majority of British subjects were still not citizens, however, but subjects. calling into question the degree to which Britain was a nation of Britons. Britons closes by taking note of debates over British identity today, especially with regard to the European Union, and the influences that originally bonded Britons are now largely gone, leading to a resurgence of English, Scottish, and Welsh identity. Back to the text. Coley's reconstruction of the forging of British national identity seems to me to be largely correct, if somewhat one-sided. Indeed, I argued in previous chapters that, in a similar fashion, contemporary British and Western identity is being recast in opposition to immigrants, the Third World, and other, quote, outsiders. What is fallacious in Coley's argument, however, is her assumption that the creation of national identity in the modern world should act as a template that is true for all time and all forms of identity, as, quote, men and women decide who they are by reference to who and what they are not. What's confronted by an obviously alien, quote, them, and otherwise diverse community can become a reassuring and merely desperate, quote, us. Footnote. I'll say, sorry, no footnote, it's just a citation. It's Coley. I guess it's Coley, that's how you say it, actually. This suggests that the perception of, quote, them and, quote, us is in some way an epistemological constant built into human, quote, nature. It is argument that derives partly from the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who believed that the human brain operates by classifying the world in terms of pairs of opposites. Both pre-literate and modern societies, argued Lévi-Strauss, think of the world in terms of binary opposites: solid, liquid, clean, dirty, truth, lie, body, soul, white, black, male, female. One side of the opposition, for instance, clean or white, is privileged or given positive affirmation, while the other, dirty or black, has negative connotations. The meaning of the positive element is generally established through the exclusion of the negative half. In other words, clean means, quote, not dirty, and white means, quote, not black. This provides the epistemological template for thinking about the world exclusively in terms of us and them, or self and other. Footnote: see Claude Lévi-Strauss, Totemism, and the Savage, and published in English in 1969, and The Savage Mind, published in 1966. The description of totemism by Claude Lévi-Strauss says, this work is significant not only for students of anthropology, but for students of philosophy and psychology as well. The distinguished anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss examines here the great variety of beliefs encompassed by totemism, the attacks to which it has been subject, and the constant attempts to restore useful meaning to totemism. Lévi-Strauss's account deals with the views of such renowned anthropologists as Boas, Van Gennep, Elkin, Fortes, Firth, Evans Pritchard, and Radcliffe Brown. It also brings to light some neglected observations by Bergson and Rousseau. In reviewing the major theories about totemism, the author notes that it has gradually come to be understood not as a distinctive institution, but as a way of thinking which is as characteristic of our own thinking as it is of the, quote, primitives, for whom totemism was an integral part of life. And the other thing I wanted to look up, the savage mind. The description of this book says... I'm not really actually finding a very good description of this book. Moving on. Excuse me. For Edward Said, this epistemological constant has become the basis for the distinction between the West and the West others. The distinction is not simply epistemological, but ontological, woven into the very being of the West. In Culture and Imperialism, Said posits the existence of a, quote, fundamental ontological distinction between the West and the West and the rest of the world, end quote. Edward Said, whose boundaries we may consider, quote, absolute, end quote. Quote, throughout the exchange between Europeans and their, quote, others, that began systematically half a millennium ago, the one idea that is scarcely varied is that there is a, quote, us and a, quote, them, each quite settled, clear, unassailably self-evident. As I discuss it in Orientalism, the division goes back to Greek thought about barbarians, but whoever originated this kind of, quote, identity thought, by the 19th century, it had become the hallmark of imperialist cultures, as well as those cultures trying to resist the encroachments of Europe, end quote. Having established a trans-historical ontological distinction that collapses the subtleties of 2 millennia of history, Said subsequently reads history backwards, conceiving of the past in terms specific to the present, so that all encounters between Europeans and their others, whatever their form, comprise part of the, quote, distinction between the West and the rest of the world, end quote. For instance, the acquisition of Ireland by England's Henry II in the 12th century is deemed to be an imperialist conquest, and the English nobility's attitudes towards the Irish is assumed to be racial in form. Quote, the high age of imperialism is said to have begun in the late 1870s, but in English-speaking realms it began well over the 700 years before. Ireland was ceded by the Pope to Henry II of England in the 1150s. He himself came to Ireland in 1171. From that time on, an amazingly persistent culture existed towards Ireland as a place whose inhabitants were a barbarian and degenerated race, end quote. Edward Said. Said does not tell us what it is about the Pope's award of Ireland to Henry II that is of the same moment as the European powers scramble for Africa from the 1870s onward. Nor does Said explain in what way 12th century perceptions of the Irish show a continuity with 19th century perceptions of Africans. That continuity is simply assumed. Such assumptions are rarely valid. Human consciousness is not static or innate, but is constantly recreated through changing social and historical circumstances. Without investigating social phenomena in their specificity, we fall into the trap of projecting specifically contemporary values and judgments onto past epochs. In Herman Melville's Moby Dick, the narrator Ishmael observes sourly that, quote, a purse is but a rag unless you have something in it, end quote. The outward appearance of something tells us little. Only through understanding an object or phenomenon in that object or phenomenon's context can we appreciate that object or phenomenon's content or meaning. This is particularly so with social phenomena such as, quote, race. Quote, a Negro is a Negro, end quote, wrote Marx. Quote, a Negro only becomes a slave in certain circumstances, end quote. Marx. Possessing a black skin does not mean that one is a slave, nor indeed that one is an object of racism. However, we have a tendency to assume this because we mistakenly assume that the contemporary signification of blackness has always been so. Take, for instance, the contemporary reading of Shakespeare's Othello. Today, the play is generally taken to be an example of the racist outlook of the Elizabethan period. Footnote, see, for example, Ruth Cowing's article, Blacks in Renaissance Drama and the Role of Shakespeare's Othello, in David Dabidene's edited volume, The Black Presidents in English Literature, published in 1985. End footnote. Yet, as C.L.R. James has pointed out, this interpretation is simply the product of our own, quote, race-ridden consciousness, end quote. For Elizabethan audiences, what was important was not Othello's, quote, race, but the fact that Othello was a stranger. Quote, you could strike out every single reference to Othello's black skin, and the play would be essentially the same. Othello's trouble is that Othello is an outsider. Othello is not a Venetian. Othello is a military bureaucrat, a technician hired to fight for Venice, a foreign country. The Senate has no consciousness whatever of his color. That is a startling fact, but true. The Senate haven't to make allowances for his color. The Senate simply has no his color simply has no place in the Senate's minds. End quote. James, Spheres of Existence, Selected Writings. The meaning of a black skin has not always been the same, nor have the concepts of self and of difference. In the past, people perceived of themselves and of others in very different fashion, indeed in ways that would strike us as irrational and incomprehensible. In Chapter 2, we saw how pre-capitalist, pre-Enlightenment views of difference resonated with ideas and fears we could barely conceive of today. We saw in the tale of Bemoine how it was possible for Europeans to regard the same African as, quote, both as, quote, one of us and as a, quote, other, depending literally on where he stood in relation to the mental map of Europe. We saw, too, how the idea of difference became transformed in the Enlightenment through the idea of equality and a single humanity. I argue in Chapter 3 that the discourse of race did not arise out of the categories of Enlightenment discourse, but out of the relationship between Enlightenment thought and the social organization of capitalism. The disparity between the abstract belief in equality and the reality of an unequal society solely give rise to the idea that differences were natural and not social. The emergence of the modern idea of race was predicated on a wide number of social, political, and economic developments, which I discussed in chapters 3 and 4. The consequence of these developments was the degradation of the universalistic outlook. We saw how the idea of race emerged not so much with reference to populations which were external to Western society, populations which were exotic or distant or physically distinct, but rather in relation to social gradations within European society. The modern discourse of race developed through the racialization of social and class differences, through the attribution of racial inferiority to the lower orders of society. the, quote, dangerous classes, end quote. Such attribution of inferiority came not from some imputed need to posit an image of self in opposition to an other, but as a way of making sense of social differences. The racial categories developed in relation to differences within European societies were subsequently transposed to the non-European world. I argue that there was a dialectical relationship between the two. The process of European modernization established Europe's superiority over the non-Western world at the same time as it revealed the differences and divisions within European societies. The coming of mass democracy on the one hand and of imperialist expansion on the other helped transform the nature of the discourse of race. It was at this point that racial difference became identified with the distinction between the West and the rest. It was also at this point that the Western elites began to understand their own identity primarily in terms of the inferiority of others. This process, we saw, was the consequence of social, political, and economic changes which undermined the optimism and self-belief of elite groups in Western society. This process of casting identity in opposition to an other has become, as we saw in Chapter 7, a principal source of Western identity in the post-Cold War era. At the same time, disillusionment with ideas of social progress, together with the impact of the Nazi experience, has helped recast the discourse of race so that social differences are today explained more in cultural or moral terms than in biological terms. We can see in this quick resume of my argument in this book that it is simply not possible to understand the discourse of race within a single framework of the West and its others. Any such attempt not only disregards the complexities of the development of the discourse of race, but misreads the origins of race, transposing race from differences within Europe to differences between Europe and the non-European world. There might appear to be a contradiction in this critique of the framework of the, quote, West and its others. On the one hand, I am claiming that contemporary theorists of difference regard the idea of the other as a product of Enlightenment universalism. In other words, as a specifically modern development. On the other hand, I am also arguing that theirs is an ahistoric understanding of the relationship between self and other, in that they view the dichotomy as an epistemological constant. There is indeed a contradiction here, but it arises out of the very use of the idea of the other. Post-structuralist and postmodernist discourse tend to regard the other as both a product of post-Enlightenment philosophy and as a constant in human perception. The conflation of these two ideas, in fact, plays a major part in the confusion about the relationship between Enlightenment discourse and the discourse of race. We can understand better both the ahistoricity of the concept of the other and the contradictions it embodies by looking in some depth at a text that was key to developing the framework of the, quote, West and its others. Edward Said's Orientalism, published in 1978, the book became very influential in Orientalism's discussion of the way in which Western understanding of the Orient, by which Said means the Middle East, meant the Middle East, imposed upon it a reality created in the West. The confusions and contradictions in the book Orientalism reflect the broader problems with post-structuralist theories of difference. All right, so that's the end of the first section of the chapter, again, which is titled "The West and Its, quote, Others." Thank you so much for listening.